Welcome to Hope is Here. My name is Greg Horn, and we're so glad that you joined us today. And the topic we're going to talk about today, unfortunately, affects a lot of families here in central Kentucky. And even though I know from our podcast that we have people that are listening in over 11 different states, from California to actually Connecticut, and a lot of people in Florida also that listen, but this is just something that a topic today and tomorrow and possibly even Wednesday that we're going to talk about, and that's addiction. And there's so many different forms of addiction, obviously, from pornography to drugs, but addiction is something that it can destroy individuals, which destroys families, and it's just caused a lot of heartache. And obviously, the premise that we started Hope is Here on is to give people hope. And my guest today, Greg Napier. He's got a great first name, obviously. Greg Napier is going to be joining us. He is an attorney by trade, but he actually spent some time, struggled a little bit with addiction with him as a teenager, but then as he was able to overcome that with his family's help and early intervention, he wound up being a counselor and helping with this issue. So we've got a guest today that knows addiction both backwards and forwards, and I know it's going to be a real blessing. So I hope that you'll be with us both Monday and Tuesday, and probably wind up being Wednesday. But Greg, this topic of addiction is something that, you know, it's not a pleasant word to talk about, but unfortunately, right. Satan has had a field day with it. So many lives have been taken, and it's a growing epidemic. The White House is talking about it, and you've seen both firsthand in your own life, but then vocationally even more, helping people. Just talk a little bit about addiction and what it means and just the destruction that we see.
Well, first of all, I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you for giving me this chance. Sometimes it's hard to talk about my experience just because it seems so far away from me. It's 35 years since then. But I believe that we need to talk about addiction in terms of kind of a spectrum. When we use the word addiction or addict, we tend to think of somebody who has kind of reached the end. They're struggling with work, maybe losing work, their family's falling apart. They've got the physical craving, the psychological, and the spiritual craving all happening. But I think that's kind of like stage 4 of cancer. That's like stage 4 of addiction. And it really is a spectrum, and I think it's helpful to talk about that and be able to recognize that it's a spectrum. So as a teen, I would not call myself as being a stage 4 addict. However, I developed a really unhealthy relationship with pot. I abused marijuana, and that was part of derailing my life at that time. So for me, fortunately, my parents intervened early, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I think it's helpful to talk about the whole spectrum and realize that it's all part of the same issue.
Well, one of the things I read, I believe it was over the weekend, there was a mother that's really trying to help create more awareness, and she said, you know, so many addicts, when they get to like stage 4 in addiction, stage 4 of cancer, that, you know, they become homeless. And she said, you know, I want people to know that even these homeless people, you know, they have a face, and they're somebody's son and somebody's daughter. Yeah. And so that's one of the things we want today is just to create some awareness. And you said, you know, just in your opening words there, and one of the huge things for you, not, you know, winding up being homeless and things, was because of early intervention by your parents. Right. And so I think it's one of the things that hopefully today out of our program, Greg, and nothing else, just comes out. What are some of the signs that parents should look for?
Right.
Because, you know, obviously there's just so many temptations out there and things, but what are some things that you could maybe share with parents from your experience?
Sure. And actually, if you don't mind, let me back up even to give context to that. I see 2 avenues into addiction, into this spectrum of addiction. And one avenue, I was talking with a clinical social worker earlier, a couple of weeks ago, and he had the story where he really was fine until early adulthood. He had his wisdom teeth taken out, and was prescribed just 3 days of oxycodone for pain, which is standard these days, and that's all it took. His body reacted in such a way that he just craved it, and it just went from there. For most of us, though, it's a way of medicating some kind of wound or hurt, and it really starts out more of a spiritual kind of thing. So for me, that wound was a single incident when I was a kid of abuse by a non-relative, and that haunted me. So as I grew up, I never talked about it, never dealt with it. As a teen, it was eating me up pretty much, along with other life circumstances, but that was really a big thing. So I began seeking for just about anyways. I'd given my life to Christ as a child, and I still remember that day, and it was so exciting and felt so good. But by the time I was a teen, I had let this event just tear me up, and I had gotten to the point where I didn't believe God would heal me and didn't believe God would bring joy into my life. So I started seeking elsewhere. And the first time, well, actually it was the second time. First time I smoked marijuana, nothing happened. But the second time, it just gave me such a sense of peace and euphoria, and that's all it took. I really wanted to keep finding that peace, even though it was fleeting and even though it was an illusion. So back to your question, what my parents saw is I became progressively sullen and intensely moody. Not normal teenage moodiness.
Right.
But this had a certain edge to it that just went beyond that. They saw me getting progressively isolated from them, isolated from friends. They saw. At one point, I ran away. I was gone for 3 days. That was a big sign to them. I became more and more secretive. Part of that was, hiding, hiding some marijuana. I hid it up in the attic. And so those kinds of behaviors, I even got to the point where I was just feeling so hopeless that I quit going to school. So all those things, they didn't have to wait until I dropped out of high school. They began seeing those signs, and they began trying to intervene well before that. And I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but they attempted when I was early teens to get me an outpatient counseling. Well, an hour a week doesn't really do a whole lot. So, they progressively tried to intervene stronger and stronger. But those were the signs. Well,
I want to backtrack just 1 second, because you brought up, I thought, a couple of great points about addiction that, one, sometimes just our body, because of whatever it is, whether it's alcohol or oxycodone, just different people's body chemistries become addicted. So sometimes that's the thing, it can't necessarily be helped. And then the second type, as you talked about, from wounds. And, the sad part is we all are going to have wounds in life, and man, I don't know that I would want to grow up as a teenager today, but even when we did, marijuana was fairly accessible, and there's a God-sized shaped hole in all of us that He wants to fill, but yet sometimes we try those things, and I've had tried marijuana before when I was that age too, so I was just fortunate I didn't have an addiction to it, and yet there's so many things, and a lot of times, even if it's not something bad, it could be even something. I know we're talking more with narcotics and things and drugs and things today, but a lot of times with addiction, it could be something that is meant for good. Like, it's good to go to the mall, but then people sometimes get a shopping addiction or alcohol, just a glass of wine at dinner, but some people becomes two, and then it becomes an alcohol addiction or pornography. I mean, the list goes on and on, but a lot of times addiction doesn't start off, nobody starts out, I guess, to be an addict. Right.
God means for us to experience peace and joy. And His kind of joy is the joy that we experience even in the midst of pain. It's the kind of joy that draws us to Him and draws us to healing. The way it took a turn for me was I believed that this was the way to find that joy. And it wasn't in the midst of pain, it was to get rid of pain. I wanted to run from the pain. And so my parents finally, in an act of desperation, and I would say I was stage 1, maybe stage 2 in terms of actual drug use, probably stage 1, but they finally intervened, and I'm thankful that they did, and they placed me in a drug rehab against my will, but it turned out for the good. It was something that God used.
So I know, no parent likes to do that, obviously, but here we are, many years later. I would say that you're thankful that they did. I
very much am. Yeah, that intervention changed my life. It wasn't only just the getting me away from the marijuana and cutting that unhealthy relationship off. It was forcing me to look at myself and deal with things and begin to come back to God and seek that relationship.
Well, so how long were you away? What was the intervention and treatment for?
Yeah, it was actually a very intensive one. I was part of that program for over a year before I became a counselor at that program. The early part of it was away from home, away from friends, away from school. It was basically an inpatient program. They used foster homes, though. So it was really intense, and that forced me to, focus on myself instead of turning to outward things.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that your parents did that, and so many times I think we try to put Band-Aids on wounds, and yet, like you said, you had early intervention because of your parents, and then it sounds like because of the length of the program and the intensity of it, obviously that's how you got healing.
Exactly, yeah. And it was a spiritual-based program, a Christian-based program too, which I think was really wonderful for me.
What would be maybe one takeaway that you could share from that time, Greg, that you learned about yourself and helped you to get a little more peace?
Well, it really was more about learning something about God and the way that God brings joy and peace into our lives. It isn't about removing pain. It isn't about just making us feel happy and making that bad stuff go away. It's about being with us in the midst of it. It's about walking with us through the pain, and it's about His promises in that. He stays with us and helps us to heal. And I think that's the biggest takeaway.
Well, that's a great takeaway for anybody, whether it's somebody struggling with addiction or you're just really hurting. You need to know that God is with you in the storms. And Greg was able to realize that as a teenager, as he went to a recovery program, and God did a great work in his heart and his life. And then he went on to become a substance abuse counselor. And so we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. So make sure if you're listening today that you'll tell somebody else that, hey, you need to tune in to Hope is Here today. And I also want to remind you, you can always catch us on our website at hopeishere.today. But I'm Greg Horn. I'm talking with Greg Napier. He's an attorney by trade, but he also had prior experience as a substance abuse counselor, and we're going to be talking with him about what he learned there and how maybe you as parents or people that have loved ones that are struggling with addiction, how maybe we can help them. I'm Greg Horn. We'll see you tomorrow on Hope is Here.
CMI is your full-service human resources provider in Central Kentucky. For 15 years, CMI Human Resources has taken great pride in helping organizations and people work. Whether it's employee handbooks or help in filling a position, no job is too large or too small for CMI. Contact the professionals today at CMI Human Resources, 859-296-2800, or online at cmiconsulting.com.